She was 12 years old when they handed her the violin as a punchline, not as an instrument, not as an opportunity, as a joke. A way to watch her fail in front of everyone and confirm what they already believed, that she didn't belong there, that she never would, that some things simply weren't made for girls like her. The music room at Hargrove Academy smelled like rosin and old wood and the particular kind of condescension that comes from people who have decided something about you before you open your mouth. 12-year-old Imani Beaumont stood at the back of the room holding a violin case she had never touched before, wearing her school uniform that was a size too big because her mother bought it with growing room, watching 45 kids who had been playing their instrument since they were 6 years old, tune their strings with the casual authority of people who have never been made to feel like outsiders. Imani was not supposed to be here. That part was never stated aloud. It didn't need to be. The open enrollment lottery that placed her at Hargrove Academy, one of the most prestigious private schools in the state of Georgia, operating under a partial public scholarship program, had been described by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution as a bold experiment in educational equity. It had been described by certain parents on the Hargrove Parent Committee as an unfortunate bureaucratic development. The distinction in those descriptions contained multitudes. Imani's mother, Renata Beaumont, worked double shifts at Grady Memorial Hospital as a licensed practical nurse. Her father, James Beaumont, drove commercial trucks cross-country, gone, sometimes 3 weeks out of every 4. They lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Vine City, a neighborhood where the houses were beautiful and old and proud and where the schools had been quietly defunded for decades. Imani had earned a near-perfect score on the district assessment exam, which triggered the lottery, which brought her to Hargrove, which brought her to this room, standing at the back in an oversized blazer, holding a violin case she had borrowed from a storage room, surrounded by people who had already decided the story of her. What none of them knew, what they couldn't have known, because they had never looked at her long enough to wonder, was that Imani Beaumont had been listening to music her entire life with the kind of attention that most people reserve for things that matter to them more than anything else in the Takao world. Her grandmother Celestine had played piano in a Vine City church for 51 years. Every Sunday of Imani's life until age 9, when Celestine passed, she sat in the front pew watching those hands move across the keys. Not watching the service. Watching the hands. Memorizing the patterns. Feeling the intervals in her chest, before she had words for what intervals were. She couldn't explain it to anyone. She had tried once, and her cousin Marcus had looked at her like she'd said something in a foreign language. But music lived in her body the way some people described faith living in theirs, present, constant, organizing everything else around it. She had never played violin. She had never held one. She had only heard them on recordings her grandmother kept, on classical radio stations, on YouTube videos she watched late at night, on a cracked phone screen after her mother fell asleep. But she had heard them with that particular attention, the kind that captures not just notes, but mechanics, not just melody, but structure. This will matter. Remember that she had never touched a violin. Music director Mr. Gerald Ashworth called roll in the way that people call roll when they already know everyone's name and are performing the process for the sake of form. He had been at Hargrove for 19 years. He had opinions held firmly and expressed in subtle ways about who belonged in serious music programs. He had taken one look at Imani on her first day 3 weeks earlier and classified her in a category his mind had already built. When he reached her name, he paused in a way that wasn't quite long enough to be deliberate but was long enough to be felt. Beaumont. Present. What instrument were you assigned? The question was wrong. He knew what instrument she had been assigned because he had assigned it. The assignments were in the folder in front of him. But he asked the question in a tone that suggested the answer might be surprising, might be incorrect, might be something she had gotten confused. Violin, sir. Somewhere to her left, a boy named Brandon Wakefield, whose father donated the new rehearsal hall that bore his grandfather's name, laughed through his nose. Not loud, just enough. Right, Ashworth said. The violin. He said it the way you might say, the astrophysics department to someone who had wandered in from the street, a polite acknowledgement of something preposterous. Here's what you need to understand about what happened next, because this is where people usually get the sequence wrong. They imagine it as a single moment. Girl plays violin, room gasps, justice delivered. That's not how it worked. What happened was slower and stranger and more devastating than that, and it began not with triumph, but with humiliation, because real stories don't skip the part where people try to break you. Imani opened the case. The violin inside was a mid-grade instrument, not the best in the room by any measure. She lifted it with both hands, studying it, not performing uncertainty, not faking confidence, just studying it the way she studied everything, with that quiet attention that the people around her had consistently mistaken for blankness. "You've played before?" Ashworth asked. "No, sir." Another nose laugh from the left. A few other small sounds that weren't quite laughter but were adjacent to it. "Well," Ashworth said, and the word carried a weight of theatrical resignation. "Let's see what we're working with." What he meant, what everyone in that room understood him to mean, was, let's get through this. Let's watch the scholarship. Kid, try to play the violin and then we'll move on. He pointed to a passage from a Vivaldi arrangement the intermediate group had been working on. A passage they all knew. He was not asking her to play something she had never seen. He was asking her to play something she had never practiced, never studied, never touched, in front of 44 peers who knew it well, as a demonstration of exactly how far behind she was. It was designed to be devastating. It succeeded. Imani set the bow on the strings and produced a sound that was not music. It was the sound of someone who had never held a violin in their life, which is to say it was the sound of a bow dragging across strings at the wrong angle, with the wrong pressure, with no muscle memory and no technique whatsoever. Scratching, scraping, a sound that made several students visibly wince. Brandon Wakefield did not bother to hide his laughter this time. Ashworth raised a hand. "Settle. Down." But the gesture was slow, unhurried, the gesture of a man who was not entirely displeased with what was happening. "That's quite all right," he said to Imani. "We'll start you with the beginner's exercises. There's no shame in starting from scratch." There was shame in the way he said it. Not his shame, hers. Placed there with the precision of someone who had been doing this for 19 years. Imani sat down. She did not cry. She did not argue. She set the violin in her lap and folded her hands and looked at the front of the room with an expression that people in that room interpreted as acceptance, as submission, as confirmation of their assessment. They were wrong about what they were seeing. They had been wrong about her since the first day. They would keep being wrong for another 6 weeks, and then they would be corrected in a way that none of them would forget for the rest of their lives. What Imani was actually doing was listening. 6 weeks is a strange amount of time, long enough to make people comfortable, long enough to establish routine, to lower defenses, to stop paying close attention to the background players in a story you think you already know the ending to. Short enough that nothing seems to have fundamentally changed. Short enough that you don't notice the change until it's already happened. In those 6 weeks, Imani did not tell anyone what she was doing. She did her beginner exercises exactly as assigned. She sat in the back of the room during ensemble rehearsals. She watched Ashworth's hands when he conducted. She watched the first chair violinist, a girl named Priya Chandrasekaran, whose technique was genuinely excellent. She watched where their wrists went when they shifted positions. She watched how their bowing arms moved, not just the direction but the weight distribution, the rotation, the relationship between elbow and shoulder. She watched all of this while appearing, to everyone around her, to be simply waiting for her turn with the beginner exercises. At home, every night she practiced, not with a teacher. She couldn't afford one. Not with sheet music. She had photographed the pages with her phone during class, zoomed in on the notation at night. Not with a better instrument, and she had checked out a standard school loaner violin, the cheapest in the storage room. But with YouTube tutorials, with her grandmother's recordings, with 3 online courses she found for free, and with the thing that had been in her the entire time, that listening, that attention, that understanding of music that lived in her body like a second language she had somehow never been given the words for, but had always known how to read. She had a gift. She had always had a gift. The gift had simply been waiting for an instrument. The first week she could hold the bow correctly. The second week, She could produce a clean, sustained tone on a single string. The third week, she played a simple scale with consistent pressure. The fourth week, she played the scale in position shifts. The fifth week, she sight-read a beginner's Bach arrangement and felt something open up in her chest that she didn't have a name for yet, but that she recognized as the feeling that had been waiting there her entire life. The feeling of doing exactly the thing you were born to do. By the end of the sixth week, late on a Thursday night in a Vine City apartment, Imani Beaumont played the Vivaldi passage from Ashworth's class, the one she had been asked to play on the first day, the one she had scraped and scratched through in front of 44 laughing classmates. And she played it cleanly, accurately, with feeling. She played it again. Better. She played it a third time, and she made changes she had been thinking about for 3 weeks, small interpretive decisions that Priya made one way and Ashworth had never corrected, but that Imani's ear told her could go another way, a deeper way, a way that leaned into what the melody was actually asking for. Then she picked up her phone and looked up the Hargrove Academy annual chamber music showcase. 11 days away, open to all students, self-nominated. She put her phone down and played the Vivaldi passage again. And then she played the piece she had actually been practicing. Not the Vivaldi, not the beginner exercises. The piece that had arrived in her head 3 weeks ago like a transmission from somewhere she couldn't name, the one she had been building note by note in the hours between midnight and 2 in the morning. A piece that was entirely her own. She played it through once, from beginning to end without stopping. She sat quietly for a moment afterward. Then she picked up the self-nomination form for the Hargrove Academy annual chamber music showcase and filled it out. The form arrived on Ashworth's desk on a Monday morning. He looked at the name. He looked at it again. He set the form down and picked it up and looked at it a third time as if it might change. Imani Beaumont, solo violin, original composition. He called her in after third period. She sat in the chair across from his desk with her hands in her lap in her uniform, blazer still 2 sizes too big and her expression exactly what it always was, present, calm, waiting. "You've nominated yourself for the showcase," he said. "Yes, sir. The showcase is for students who have reached at least intermediate proficiency." "I understand. You are currently at the beginner level." "I understand." He waited for her to say something else. She didn't. "Imani." He leaned forward. His tone shifted. Not unkind, but the kind of not unkind that is still condescension, still management. "I think it's wonderful that you're enthusiastic, I really do. But the showcase is attended by parents, board members, alumni. It represents the school. I have to consider the program's reputation." She nodded slowly. "What if," he continued, warming to what he clearly considered a gracious solution, "we work toward next year? Give yourself proper time to develop. You've only been at this 6 weeks. I'd like to play the showcase, sir." He blinked. "Imani, the form is open to all students. I checked. It doesn't specify a proficiency requirement." There was a pause. A long one. "That's correct," he said carefully. "But as music director, I have discretion over—" "I'm happy to play for you first," she said, "so you can make an informed decision." Something in his expression shifted. Not changed, shifted. A small recalibration. He had prepared for one type of conversation and was having a different one. "All right," he said after a moment. "Play something." She had brought the violin. She hadn't said anything about bringing it, but she had brought it. She took it from the case, tuned it in approximately 12 seconds. Not showy, just efficient. The tuning of someone who has been doing it long enough that her ear knows exactly where the string needs to go. Set it on her shoulder, adjusted her chin rest, and took a breath. She played the Vivaldi, not the whole arrangement. Just the passage he had asked her to play on the first day. The passage that had produced scratching and scraping and laughter. She played it from memory, cleanly, with correct bow distribution and position shifts, and a tone that was, by any honest assessment, more than beginner. Solidly intermediate, maybe more. Ashworth said nothing for a moment. He stopped. How long have you been practicing? Every night since the first day. He processed this. That's 6 weeks, Imani. What you just played takes most students, year. Sometimes 2. I know. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the ones before. What's the original composition? He asked. She played it. She played 4 minutes and 17 seconds of something that had no name yet except in her own mind. Something she thought of as Vine City Sunday, though she had not told anyone that, and would not until much later. It began with a melody that moved like her grandmother's hands over piano keys on Sunday morning. Unhurried, certain, carrying something heavy and turning it into something luminous. It built through a middle section that was complicated and dissonant and physically demanding, a section that required position shifts and dynamic control and a level of technical vocabulary that 6-week violinists simply did not have. It resolved in a third section that was quieter than anything. Just the melody from the beginning returned to its bones, the way grief returns you to the simplest truths. Ashworth did not speak when she finished. She waited. He looked at his desk. He looked at his hands. He looked at her. Who taught you that? He asked. I wrote it. Who taught you to write it? No one. He was quiet for a long time. Imani, he said finally. His voice had changed. Not dramatically, but the management was. Gone from it. I owe you an apology. She looked at him steadily. I'd like to play the showcase, sir. He was quiet for one more moment. Yes, he said. You would. She was the last act. That was not Ashworth's doing. It was the order of the evening, set weeks earlier, alphabetical by grade and then by instrument. Imani was last because she was 6th grade, solo violin, and the 6th grade soloists went at the end. Nobody had thought to change it. Nobody had anticipated that the last act would matter. The Hargrove Academy chapel held 300 people. It was full. Parents in good suits, board members with programs, alumni who gave to the endowment and came to events like this to confirm that the endowment was being well spent. The orchestra director from Georgia State who had been invited, as a guest, sat in the 4th row. A journalist from the art section of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution was in the 7th row, covering the showcase as a minor feature on private school arts education. Priya Chandrasekaran had opened the solo violin section 40 minutes earlier and had been genuinely excellent. She played Mendelssohn with the polish of someone who has been groomed for Mendelssohn since she was 5 years old, and the audience had responded warmly because they recognized what they were seeing and it confirmed everything they expected. And there is comfort in that kind of recognition. The rest of the evening had been lovely and competent and exactly what it was supposed to be. When Imani was announced, last act, original composition, no further introduction, there was a brief confusion in the audience, not hostile, just the mild readjustment of people who have been settled into a familiar program and are now being told the final item is something different from what they expected. Some people checked their programs. Some people looked at their neighbors. Brandon. Wakefield's parents were in the 2nd row. Brandon was seated 3 rows behind them, in the student section, and he was looking at his phone when Imani walked out, and he looked up because his mother touched his arm. Imani Beaumont was in the back row. She had gotten off a double shift 2 hours earlier and had driven from Grady Memorial in scrubs she changed out of in the hospital bathroom, arriving 7 minutes before Imani was announced. She was in the last seat near the exit, and she was clutching a program in both hands, and her eyes were bright. Imani walked to the center of the chapel stage. She was wearing the school uniform, still slightly too big in the blazer. She had straightened her hair and put it up, but several pieces had come loose from the drive-over, and the overall impression was not of a performer prepared for presentation, but of a child who had walked in from somewhere else and was standing very still in a place she had decided to occupy. She set her violin on her shoulder. She didn't look nervous. She didn't look confident either in the performed way. She looked like what she was, someone who was about to do the thing she was meant to do and had known it was coming, and was ready. She placed her bow on the strings. She did not play the Vivaldi. She played Vine City Sunday. What happened in the next 4 minutes and 17 seconds is difficult to describe without sounding like an exaggeration, not because it was supernatural, not because the music was impossible, but because of what it did to the room and the specific nature of what it revealed, and the fact that 300 people who had come to hear what they expected were suddenly hearing something they had not prepared themselves for. The opening melody arrived quietly. There's a particular quality to music written by someone who has not been taught the rules of composition, not the absence of structure, but a different relationship to structure, one built entirely from listening rather than instruction. The melody that opened Vine City Sunday did not announce itself. It arrived the way Sunday morning arrives in a neighborhood that has been through a long week, gently, with weight. It moved in an interval pattern that a trained ear would recognize as unusual, not incorrect, but not conventional, the choice of someone who had arrived at those intervals by feeling rather than theory. In the second row, Brandon Wakefield's mother stopped looking at her program. The melody repeated, then shifted. And here is where the room began to change, because Imani's bow moved into the middle section, the complicated, dissonant, demanding passage that she had built to carry the part of the story that couldn't be said gently. And the sound that came out was not what a 12-year-old who had been playing for 6 weeks was supposed to sound like. It was technically accomplished in ways that should have taken years. The position shifts were clean and fast and accurate. The dynamic control, the way the volume breathed, grew, contracted, was the kind of thing music teachers spend years teaching students to find, and this child had found it alone in a Vine City apartment between midnight and 2 in the morning because she had nothing but time and attention and a body that understood something about sound that nobody had ever helped her name. The Georgia State Orchestra director in the 4th row leaned forward. The journalist in the 7th row had stopped taking notes. Imani Beaumont, in the back row, had tears running down her face and was making no effort to stop them. The middle section built and then broke. The way grief breaks, the way something held too tight finally releases. And the melody from the beginning returned, but not the same, changed by everything that had come between, quieter and more true. The way you come back to a thing after it has cost you something and find it means more now. Imani held the final note. Let it decay. Silence. 300 people did not move. This is the part of these stories that gets shortened in the telling, but I want to stay here for a moment, in this silence, because it was not an ordinary silence. It was not the silence of an audience waiting to know if it was over so they could applaud. It was the silence of 300 people who had just heard something that required a moment to absorb, who were sitting with the experience of having been shown something they hadn't expected to be shown, who were in the process of adjusting their understanding of what was possible. Brandon Wakefield's father was a man who had cultivated his entire adult life around the confidence of correct assessment. He was a real estate attorney who made decisions quickly and relied on that quickness. As a mark of his competence, he looked at Imani Beaumont standing on the stage of the Hargrove Chapel and felt, for the first time in some years, that he had been catastrophically wrong about something, and that the wrongness had happened quickly and without his awareness, and that this was a deeply uncomfortable thing to discover in a very public place. Gerald Ashworth, sitting in the faculty row to the left of the stage, had tears in his eyes. He was not performing emotion. The music had done to him what music can do to people who have spent their lives in it, broken through the professional layer and found something underneath that hadn't been accessed in a while. A parent in the 5th row began to applaud. Then another. Then the room, all at once, like a breath finally released. A standing ovation in the Hargrove Chapel was not unheard of, but it was rare, and it was always deliberate, always a considered social decision made row by row as people watched to see who else was standing before they committed. This was not that. This was simultaneous, instinctive, the response of people whose bodies had decided before their minds caught up. Imani stood on the stage and watched 300 people stand up. She did not. Bow. Not immediately. She stood very still for a moment, and the expression on her face was not triumphant. That would come later, in the car with her mother, where she cried in a way she hadn't allowed herself to cry since the first day in the music room. What she felt standing on that stage was something quieter than triumph. It was the feeling of being correctly seen for the first time by people who had looked at her wrong for a long time, and it was not uncomplicated. It was not simply good. It was good and painful and true all at once, the way things are when they matter. She bowed. The applause did not stop. What happened afterward happened fast and then slow, the way consequences usually work. Fast. The Georgia State Orchestra director, whose name was Dr. Marcus Webb, a tall, bearded man who had conducted professionally for 30 years and taught privately for 20, walked backstage before Imani had even finished putting her violin away. He introduced himself to Imani Beaumont, who was still in her hospital scrubs with dried tears on her face, and he said words that Imani would repeat for the rest of her life. "Your daughter has a talent I have encountered perhaps 4 times in 30 years. I would like to talk to you about what comes next." The journalist from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution filed a story that night, not the minor feature on private school arts education she had planned, but something else entirely. It ran the following week under the headline, "She Taught Herself. Violin in 6 weeks. Then she played the room silent." It was shared 14,000 times in the first 48 hours and caught the attention of a classical music magazine, a national education nonprofit, and a foundation that gave music scholarships to underprivileged students that paid full tuition to summer music intensives. Slow, Gerald Ashworth requested a private meeting with Imani and Renata on the Thursday following the showcase. He sat across from them in his office and said things that were hard for him to say and that he said anyway. He talked about assumptions. He talked about the ways systems create expectations and the ways those expectations become self-fulfilling when they're applied to students rather than questioned. He talked about specific moments, the first day assignment, the call-out, the initial refusal of the showcase nomination. He did not make excuses. He said, "I was wrong, and I'm sorry, and I intend to be different." Renata listened with the patience of a woman who had listened to a great many apologies in her life and had learned to distinguish the ones worth accepting from the ones that were performances. She accepted this one, not because it erased what had happened, but because it was real. Imani, for her part, said something that ended up in the journalist's follow-up piece 3 months later, when she was asked what she thought about everything that had unfolded. She was 12 years old and she said it plainly without drama, in the way that 12-year-olds sometimes say things that adults spend entire careers trying to articulate. "They gave me the violin as a joke, but I was already the music. The violin was just the part they could finally hear." The summer after 7th grade, Imani attended the Atlanta Youth Symphony Intensive on a full scholarship. She was the youngest student admitted in the program's history, and the first in 5 years to be admitted, having played her instrument for less than 2 years. Dr. Webb, who served on the program's faculty board, arranged for her to study with a private instructor named Yuki Tanaka, who had performed with orchestras in 4 countries and who, upon hearing Imani play for the first time, sat quietly for a long moment and then said, "You know what the instrument is already. Now I'll teach you what it can do." Imani was 15 when she played Carnegie Hall for the first time, as part of the Atlanta Youth Symphony's touring ensemble. She was 17 when she was awarded a full scholarship to the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia, the most selective music conservatory in the country. She was 19 when she performed her own composition, not Vine City Sunday, which she had retired to a place of private meaning, but something she called Renewal, which premiered with the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra on a Saturday night in October. Her mother was in the front row. Her father had driven back early from a cross-country run to be there. Several rows behind them, Gerald Ashworth, who had traveled from Atlanta with his wife for the occasion, sat in the dark of Symphony Hall and listened to the sound of something he had almost prevented, and felt the particular feeling of a man who made a terrible mistake and was allowed to witness the correction. Brandon Wakefield, for his part, attended a good university and became a real estate attorney like his father, and occasionally told the story at dinner parties. He told it at first the way people tell stories they're embarrassed by, briefly, defensively, moving quickly to the ending. Later he told it differently. In the later version he would say, "She walked into that room and we handed her a violin to watch her fail, and she took it." He would pause. "I've thought about that a lot, about the things we hand people to humiliate them that they end up turning into something we never imagined." He was not the hero of the story, but he understood what the story meant. There's something people get wrong about stories like this. They look for the moment of justice as a single event, the gasp, the applause, the standing ovation. They want the humiliation of the bad actors to be the point. And I understand that. There is something in us that wants the Hargrove Music Room, October 6 weeks in, to have a cleaner ending. Ashworth's face falling, Brandon's laughter stopping, the room going silent in a different way. But that's not where the power was. The power was in the 6 weeks between. It was in a 12-year-old girl who had just been handed a violin as a punchline, who had just scraped and scratched through a passage while people laughed, who had just been told she could start with the beginner exercises, and who came home that night, opened the case, and started practicing. Not to prove something, not in anger, in love. Because the music was already in her, had always been in her, and she had finally found the thing it needed. She didn't need their belief to begin. She didn't wait for permission or encouragement or correct conditions. She worked in the hours, between midnight and 2 in the morning with a borrowed violin and a cracked phone screen, building something in the dark, alone, because it was hers to build. They gave her the violin as a joke. She took it as a gift. And on a night in October, in a chapel full of people who had already made up their minds about her, she walked to the center of a stage and played the music that had been living in her body her entire life, waiting for exactly this moment. And the room went silent in the most powerful way a room can go silent, not because of absence, but because of presence. Because of a 12-year-old girl from Vine City who understood something about herself that everyone around her had missed. That the underestimation of others is only a verdict if you accept it. She never accepted it. She played.